Hi all, let's continue looking at other Magnus Carlsen against Vishy Anand encounters, and this time from the classical encounter at Linares 2008. Linares was a fantastic series of tournaments which Kasparov dominated in the 90s, and he was using systems like the King's Indian defense. When Vishy Anand started winning Linares or doing very well, he used extensively the Slav defense, and in this encounter against Magnus he used the Slav defense. Let's have a look. D4 for Magnus. In the previous year, Magnus had already lost to the Slav defense in the previous Linares, and in that game he had closed in his queen's bishop with an early e3, and he had actually developed this knight rather than he'd rather developed this knight first and then played e3. Here we see a year later Magnus playing instead knight f3. After knight f6, now knight c3, and after e6, is he going to close in his bishop? Well, in this game he changes the opening strategy. Playing e3 is actually the most popular move on my live book. The evaluations are about equal for either e3 or bishop g5. Another popular move is c takes d. Another one is g3, but in this game we saw bishop g5, and this can lead to razor sharp positions. This next move by black is h6, encouraging white to give up the dark square bishop. That is the most common move, just to play bishop takes f6, but Magnus retreated it to h4, which is also a common move, not as popular as just taking on f6. Now we see d takes c4, the top move, e4, and this is a very, very sharp line. g5, the bishop goes back to g3. So it looks as though if black's going to castle kingside, he might have some weaknesses with these pawns, but this is all theoretical. b5 now, so black is a pawn up. Now the most common move in this position is bishop e2. Magnus played actually knight e5, and now either bishop b7 or h5 are two very common moves. In the game we see actually h5, and here the top move by far, well, on small game samples, is actually for white to play h4. Now an example of playing h4 here, if h4 is played, this is an example continuation. The idea is to fix these pawns and then undermine later with f3. So for example, bishop e2, bishop b7, white can castle, knight bd7, queen c2. We can get this position, knight takes bishop g7, rook ad1, castles, and actually black is potentially threatening the move knight h7 here to put pressure on d4. So white usually plays bishop g3 to be able to answer knight h7 with e5. So this wouldn't be a very good idea here. And actually, if f3, if f3 is played immediately, knight h7 is quite good for black in this position. So bishop g3 is the most played move here, and then in this position e5. And if black plays, what does black play here? If black plays knight d7, then now we can finally target with f3 the kingside pawns. So this is the most common strategy available actually when black plays h5. The idea is to fix the pawns and then later play for f3. But Magnus actually plays f3, and this is a much rarer move indeed. Now we're out of book, and I'll put on a Gambit. Vishy now plays h4, the bishop goes to f2. It looks as though g5 might be a target in the future. Bishop b7, not moving this bishop, not aiming to castle quickly. Instead, after bishop e2 again, knight bd7, white takes on d7, knight takes d7. Now white castles, and black strikes in the centre with e5, trying to undermine white's dark square control. We see a4, a6. Here d5, and this might have been in Magnus's preparation so far, But this next move may have caught Magnus by surprise. Well, apparently in post-game interviews it did actually. I wonder if you can spot what Black played here, and these arrows are no clue as to what Black played really, so I'm going to try and remove them. If I gave you 10 seconds here, what would you play with Black? Or you might want to pause the video. So a very interesting position. Do you want to aim to castle kingside? What are the issues here? What would you do with Black? So 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, a very surprising move in many ways, but very, very logical. It's a rook lift, so not castling kingside, removing the rights to castle kingside with rook h6. It does mean actually that the critical d6 square is more covered than usual, so Black might even want to play bishop c5 without worrying so much about the resulting weakness of d6 if the rook's covering it. Also, of course, the rook can later come to d6 maybe as well at the right time. If a normal looking move like bishop c5 was played here, then White might be better just with d takes, bishop takes c6, just taking on c5, and then after a takes b, this d6 square is going to be exploited. For example, rook takes a8 here. If Black doesn't want to lose b5, he has to take with the queen. So he takes with the queen, and now we see queen d6, and White would have an advantage here. White's getting an initiative. Black can't castle it. It looks very, very uncomfortable. White's slightly better. It's not the end of the world by any means, but White is slightly better. But this whole innovation here is remarkable. And if this is the kind of innovation in the upcoming World Championship match, then Magnus is going to be faced with great difficulties if this type of innovation is played. This type of innovation here is quite remarkable. So in this game, it seems here now Magnus was on his own and had to improvise, but it looks as though he is actually technically a pawn down. And even though at the moment the Black pawns are doubled, with d5, he's going to undouble the pawns and give Black a more solid pawn up. A 2-to-1 majority on the queen side is emerging here. What can White do if he doesn't play d takes c6? He's committed to this d5. Maybe he was hoping for some sort of weakness exploitation. But what does White do now? If he plays a takes b, then this is no good. A takes b. What is actually White doing? Black is simply threatening now bishop c5 without any d6 concern, with far less d6 concern. Just getting rid of this bishop is White's better bishop, leaving this bishop which is cramped already by these pawns. So this is not a very nice position. So in the game, Magnus tries d takes c6 after bishop takes c6. I think this was the lesser evil choice, but now maybe keeping the tension that was an idea. Queen c1 just hitting g5, keeping some pressure on g5, but it's a difficult position. It is a pawn down. It's unclear what White's plan is here. In the game, Magnus played a takes b after a takes, rook takes a8. Now of course queen takes a8 to keep b5 protected, and now queen c1 attacking g5. So how is g5 going to be protected? Are there any little traps here? Well, let's see. If bishop e7, then that's not losing on the spot to something like bishop e3, because always knight c5 here is nice. So this is possible as well, bishop e7 as a move, but in fact we see maybe an even stronger way of defending the pawn. Just rook g6. Now this rook is not just defending d6 and this 6th rank, but potentially threatening the undermining g4 at the right time to undermine White's centre. In fact, if you look at this, Black has now a fantastic knight manoeuvre available. Knight c5 to b3 to d4, potentially. But first maybe exchanging off the dark squared bishop to make white weaker on the dark squares, and then this knight maneuver to d4. So white is standing worse out of the opening at move 21. Rook d1 was played, and now it is entirely possible to play bishop c5. Why not weaken white on the dark squares before this knight maneuver? In fact, if we play this knight maneuver now, white might be still doing okay with knight d5 in this position, threatening knight c7, and if queen b8, then queen c3, and potentially knight b4 is on the cards, or it's keeping the blockade. The pawns are held at bay here, and it's a bit trickier for black. If knight b3, then white even has some dynamic possibilities of interest. Things like f4 might be possible. Very, very dynamic possibilities to get some counterplay. It's interesting. But in the game, no, we see actually the move bishop c5. So the prelude to walking the knight on the dark squares is to exchange off the dark square bishop first. What else does Magnus have if he doesn't take on c5? This would be a nasty check, bringing his king out if black is allowed bishop takes f2. So bishop takes c5, knight takes c5, and it's becoming clearer and clearer that black now has a dangerous pawn majority on the queen side, an extra pawn on the queen side, and the harmony of black's pieces is outstanding. Even the rook seems to be helping all the other pieces for a potential attack with g4 if there wasn't a very fine positional plan available of just putting the knight on d4 here. After queen e3, attacking the knight, knight b3, the knight is simply coming to d4. There's nothing white can do here apart from a very dynamic computer generated possibility on my analysis here, which seems absolutely crazy, but I think such a move has been played in past master games. I'm pretty sure Botvinnik has played such a breakthrough pawn move. This is just one possibility to try and generate some play. f4, it looks absolutely outrageous. What it does, it opens up the bishop to h5, and it weakens, it creates some roots as well on dark squares. For example, G takes f4, queen h3, and white has this threat, but black's still better. If black doesn't panic, we can enter a sharp variation like this, where white could sack a piece, but take one or two pawns, but it's still ultimately black is better here. If check, knight d4, we're a long way off things, but black will end up being better. So it's a very, very dangerous idea to play f4, but it really doesn't, with best play, it doesn't really give much. If e takes f4, then that's a little bit more promising for white dynamically, with queen b6, with this idea of bishop h5. So for example, h3, and white might have well, knight b5 is on the cards here. What else does black do here? If he plays b4, then again knight b5. So this would actually help white get back in the game here, this f4 in this position. You might think, well, why isn't b5 an issue there, and it is after f4? Well, f4 also undermined the d4 square for the knight. That knight d4 is powerful now after queen b6. So the f4 prelude makes actually queen b6 more effective without the harassment of knight d4. In the game we see queen b6, and it looks as though white's threatening b5, but black now just plays knight d4, protects b5 with the knight, and black has quite serious threat here. Positionally, a positional threat. It's not what you might think. The threat is not actually the discovered attack on the queen. That's not the issue here. If we give white a move, I'm going to demonstrate this. If white played h3, which is not the game continuation, and we try bishop takes e4, it looks as though that's a tactical threat. But in fact, white here has some counterplay with either queen c5 or queen c7. This looks crazy to sack this pawn, but here look, knight takes e2, knight takes, and what is black actually doing? He's actually threatened with a few things. Say he moves the bishop back to c6, then queen takes e5, so white's back in the game here. Queen takes g5 is possible. This position, white's getting a lot of pawns and the king is a bit exposed. There's a bit of counterplay here basically. King f1 getting another tempo attacking the rook, and we get a lot of checks. We get a potential perpetual check. So these types of possibilities though are just a dream though in this position, because actually the real threat is not bishop takes e4, but actually to play queen d8, just get the queens off. This leaves black better with no fight, because actually black's also, as well as attacking the queen, is threatening knight takes e2 check and queen takes d1 when the knight takes. So if queen c5, queen d6, it's unavoidable for the queens not to come off here, and this position is just worse now for white. So that is the major threat. So it seems the last possibility, in fact this computer generated possibility here in this position before this knight d4 happens, is really actually very, very clever. The computer's resource is actually very, very clever in light of knight d4, especially if e takes f4, but with g takes f4 it's far from clear. So it would make queen b6 more effective. But in the game continuation, so let's see, we have this horrible knight d4, and it's really a dismal position now. A really dismal position, because here black is threatening the aforementioned queen d8 with the knight takes, not just attacking the queen, but knight takes e2 check. In this position now, what does white do? Well, Magnus tried the exchange sacrifice, rook takes d4. Now it looks initially as this a little bit scary. Well, it was just taken. Now knight takes b5 was played. What else? If queen takes d4, then black's got queen a1 check, and now queen c1, and black's just going to play rook e6 or queen f4, and is the exchange up. There isn't much compensation. White's pieces are actually quite passive here. So knight takes b5 was the intention. Bishop takes b5. Queen takes b5 check. Queen c6. Magnus at least can get another pawn with check, taking the d pawn. But now just queen b6 forces the queens off. And it's a miserable situation. The exchange down for just one pawn. The exchange down. So queen f2 doesn't really help. Black just plays, for example, rook c6, protecting the pawn. He's going to exchange off queens next. So Magnus took on b6, and he's playing the exchange down. A not very nice situation to have. Bishop takes c4, move 31. Rook takes b2. Now the rest of this game is a kind of demonstration of technique. How does black actually make progress here? The exchange up. It's going to be quite tricky, isn't it? Let's see. g3. The king, it's apparent the king's cut off. It's a classic rook on the 7th. Where does the black king need to get to? Let's see. f6, putting all the pawns first on the dark squares away from the bishop. Bishop e6. How is black making progress? Well, he brings his king up. Bishop g4. Now the king can be brought to d6, but actually we see rook e2 here. G takes, h3. It seems, well, it's apparent that the king's not going to be playing much of a role here. Spectating for the moment. King d6, as black's king comes up the board. King f1, rook b2, staying on the dark square as well. f4, king c5, the king's coming in. e5. Here is an interesting decision. Black can actually just take here, it seems, with an advantage. But maybe an even stronger move, just rook b4, threatening rook takes f4 check. Well, it's difficult for white to do anything about that, so he has to accept that. E takes, rook takes f4 check, but the king can potentially come to e2 here. It's not a big deal in this position if the king comes to e2, and it does. King d4. In fact, there's a potential problem here that the king has strayed away from this h pawn. So if this pawn can be removed, then rook takes g4 will be potentially queening the h pawn, depending on how far the king is from the h pawn. So bear that in mind. Bishop f3, now rook takes f6, so there's no distraction now for white. Bishop b7, rook b6, attacking the bishop, bishop c8. King e4, the king's going to be potentially driven back with a check here. Bishop g4, it is driven back. King e1. Now king e3, threatening horrible looking check to drive the bishop to d1. King f1, king f4, king e1, king g3, king f1, check, king e1, rook f4. Now the threat is clearly rook takes g4 to queen this pawn. Bishop c8, rook f8, bishop g4. Has white got a fortress here at move 52? King g2 is played. What's the idea? King e2, check, driving the king one file to the left, in fact, here. King f2, so the king's quite distant now from the h pawn. If only rook takes g4 was achievable. Bishop f5, check, king d4, king f3 is played here, check, king f4. So another opposition with the white king. What's going on here? What is black threatening here? Well, again, rook g3 just taking on g4 is on the cards. King d5, check, king d4, and now rook g5. And Magnus here, I believe, resigned. How is actually the fortress being destroyed? Let's have a look. How is the fortress being destroyed? Say bishop e6. Now, I've actually consulted a table base here, so forget engine analysis. This is in table base territory. What does black actually want to do here? And why was it important to get the opposition? Well, it's usually important to get the opposition to drive the king away a bit further. If you have a rook, to drive the king, to the left here in this sort of position. If black is too direct and just trying to sacrifice back the exchange to get past pawn, a disastrous draw could occur. Before showing you this, let's have a look at a really silly method here. Okay, in this position, if we have instead of rook g1, which is trying to push the king back one file to the left using that opposition, but if instead, let's see a silly method just to demonstrate the king just trying to get to the pawn. Say king f3, king g2. We're just trying to munch the pawn to let the rook come to g3. This isn't that hot here. For example, king f4, and the king's come back, and we're only just going to get a draw here horrifically. This is just what can be really, really silly. The pawn's not making progress, so a little bit of endgame here. The king's never escaping in this position, because here we get the draw with this. Okay, so we've actually got to put the king away a bit further using the opposition, not let the king come back. And we're in table-based territory here. So after an example, bishop e6 at move 60. So we're going to take some move 60 examples. Bishop e6 is the first one. Rook g1 just to drive the king back with rook d1 check. And the table base is actually giving the best move for black to actually voluntarily move the king here to the left. That seems very, very sad. Now let's use an engine just to check other alternatives here. What other alternatives are there? I think it's pretty bad at the moment. Bishop d5. We're still forcing the king back. So once we force the king back, we can then go for that. It's just too far away now to stop the idea of taking the pawn. So we can just go and take the pawn now, and we're queening. So it was very, very important to drive the king even further back with rook g1. So it's something to bear in mind to get the opposition to drive the king further back. And you might think, well, hold on, okay, what about bishop d7? Does that make a difference? Here again, rook g1, bishop e6, check, and we carry on like that. Same, much the same principle. Is there any major differences? Bishop c8, rook g3 is a little bit different, because here actually there's a smart thing technically which can be done, which is embarrass the bishop. The bishop's kind of a bit overloaded here in this position. After bishop e6, rook g1, and after king d3, stopping the king, being pushed to the left. But here there's a different method, surprising that you might think. A tactical method exists here, that the bishop's overloaded after king e5, believe it or not. And this is table-based territory. I'm showing you variation here from table-based, king e5. This is like absolute science. So bishop d7, we just lose the bishop to rook d1 check. If bishop c8, in this position, rook g8, and the bishop cannot help h3 here. If bishop d7, we just play rook d8. It's overloaded. If bishop g4, we just take on g4 in this position, and we're queening our pawn very quickly. So that doesn't help. Bishop e6, that moves 60, or bishop c8. What else? Bishop e2. In this position, table-based method. So even though it seems to stop the check method to get the king to the left, we have king g3 here. And the bishop's awkward here with bishop f1, because now just rook f5. Bishop's overloaded. Can't protect h3. So that's the most crunching, elegant continuation. Sorry, rook f5 and then just taking here. So after this rook g5, so we've examined bishop e6, bishop c8, bishop e2. On king d3 we just take on g4. So rook g5 really does spell disaster for white, whatever happens here. As long as black is not silly enough to allow that draw going for h3 too quickly. No, the idea is to kick the king or overload the bishop, basically. Those are the two principal methods of winning this position. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.